Welcome to Alberta Wilderness Association's 20th Wilderness and Wildlife Trust Lecture and Awards Evening. We are honored that so many of you have joined our celebration evening. There are more than 80 of you from across Alberta, from the West Coast and as far east as Ottawa and as far north as the Yukon. Acknowledgement of the land is a traditional custom of Indigenous people when welcoming others to their land and into their homes. By acknowledging the land, we honor the original people of this territory. We live, work, and play on the traditional territories that have been the home to many Indigenous peoples from time immemorial and continues to be the home of many Indigenous peoples today. This evening, we welcome you to this celebration from this place called Mohkinstsis, the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nation, and the Métis Nation Region 3. We acknowledge these peoples who have lived, worked, played, and stewarded this land. It is on their history and on their legacy that we continue to build history today. We honor and celebrate these lands, and we acknowledge the traditional lands where you may be joining us from this evening. Tonight, we dedicate this celebration to our wild and free spaces, the wildlife that depend on them, and to the people who care and defend them. People like each one of you here this evening, and the people who work for and support AWA. Together with your help, the staff and volunteer board of directors keep AWA moving forward with integrity, tenacity, and dedication. Carolyn Campbell, Grace Wark, Sean Nichols, Nissa Peterson, and Ian Urquhart, board president Jim Campbell, and directors Owen McGoldrick, Chris Saunders, Richard Secord, Jamie Jack, Gail Dawkin, Frank Calder, Clint Dawkin, Cliff Wallace, and Vivian Ferris are here virtually and in person for this celebratory evening. Indeed, we are here to celebrate. Please reflect for a moment with me on the lands and on that beautiful image on your screen. And if you have one, raise your glass. The wild Alberta skies we are so blessed to know, to the wild spaces we defend, to the wild and free wildlife, and to the friends and colleagues and amazing people who join us here this evening as we share in the quest for wild spaces forever. Thank you. Cheers. We'll ask Vivian Ferris to join me here, and I'll give her the podium.
Thank you, Christiane. Once again, hello everybody out there in vacuum land. It's weird to be looking at a bunch of empty chairs and addressing those again, but this is what we have to do under the circumstances. So instead of a gala, a bunch of people out here, I hope you can see me back there in your armchairs. The year 2020 represents the 20th anniversary of these awards, and I know we are hardly catching up with the many who deserve recognition. We began in the year 2000 with the Wilderness and Wildlife Defender Awards, supplemented by a gala evening event and a lecture by a distinguished conservation environmental person. Often this person was also an award recipient. Later, the annual distinguished lecture was renamed to honor one of Alberta's most outstanding environmental leaders, and that was Dr. Martha Kostuch. Later too, a second set of awards was included, this one named for one of Alberta's most outstanding birds, the Great Grey Owl, and presented periodically to outstanding volunteers. During my term as AWA president in the 1980s and into the 1990s, I got to meet a large number of environmental and conservation leaders throughout the province. These people worked with local to provincial and national organizations. There were many impressive people, all working towards the common good, but in ways that were sometimes resented by parts of society and who even had to endure hostility at times. It was not easy work, often not comfortable work, and not always rewarding work. Still, these people were convinced that a healthy environment and stable ecosystems trumped economic gain and consumptive development. And so they struggled on, often with little celebration or recognition. I dreamed of a way of recognizing the best of these, even if it had to be posthumously. And this was the case with the very first award and several thereafter. The first reward recipient was Orville Paul, a noted cougar researcher and government wildlife biologist who was killed in his line of duty. Around the year 2000, when Peter Sherrington was serving as president and Christiane was AWA's new executive director, the three of us met to begin rolling the ball towards what has become AWA's prestigious awards night, its annual special lecture, and its ever-growing wall of fame. We add to this wall of fame tonight with the 49th person to be named a Wilderness and Wildlife Defender, and that person is Linda Duncan. Our 20th year is being treated differently in that we are awarding 3 new defenders, and we have asked all 3 to be distinguished Martha Kostuch lecturers. We heard an inspiring and heartfelt presentation from Kevin Van Tighem in September, and tonight we will hear Linda's message about law and the environment. I want to just finish by saying that we at AWA have known Linda for decades and all appreciate her pioneering work in establishing the Environmental Law Centre in Alberta and her long service as a Member of Parliament. I want to personally thank her for often providing a bed for me and our past Executive Director, Diane Pahal, as we attended one meeting or another in Edmonton. She was always there for us. So Linda, thanks for that too. Good night.
I guess I'm on.
No, you're not on.
You're on.
I'm on. My ode to Meatball, my long lost bulldog. Anyways, good evening, everyone. My name is Ian Urquhart. I'm the editor of the Wildlands Advocate here at AWA. Remarkable. The wall behind me is decorated with plaques recognizing some pretty remarkable people. Tonight we add another plaque to this wall, and I would argue we recognize someone who we should regard as among the most remarkable of the remarkable, and that person is Linda Duncan. Linda Duncan should go down in Alberta history as one of our most inspirational environmental pioneers. I suspect that when most of us ask ourselves why Linda is a remarkable person, we think of her as the Member of Parliament for Edmonton, Strathcona, an office she held for nearly 11 years. There in Parliament, Linda championed environmental causes, championed environmental rights, sponsored private members' legislation to establish a Canadian Environmental Bill of Rights. But Linda's passion and devotion to environmental protection and rights predated her arrival in Ottawa by nearly a generation. I advisedly use the term pioneer to describe Linda. Why? Well, as Vivian alluded to a minute ago, we owe the birth, the founding of Alberta's Environmental Law Centre in the early 1980s to Linda. When she was enticed a few years later to work for the Mulroney government in 1987, we won't hold that against her, she went to Ottawa to lead a newly established environmental enforcement unit at Environment Canada. She left the mark of an environmental pioneer abroad as well. Her career took her to Jamaica, to Indonesia, and to Bangladesh. And in all three countries, she helped create and establish environmental law enforcement systems. So it's a great honor for me tonight to unveil Linda's plaque on this wall behind me. Please join me in congratulating Linda, a great environmental pioneer, on this recognition.
Okay. Good evening. I'm Cliff Wallace. I'm one of the directors of the AWA, and I've been around a bit, and I've known Linda for a long time. So welcome. Every year, the Alberta Wilderness Association hosts the Martha Kostuch Annual Wilderness and Wildlife Lecture, given by a renowned guest speaker. The lecture is meant to inform, challenge, and inspire AWA and its members, as well as further our mission of defending wild Alberta through awareness and action. The lecture honors Martha Kostuch, perhaps Alberta's most dogged environmental advocate and a friend who we miss dearly. She was a national leader that left Canadians with an enormous legacy. Martha was recognized with Alberta Emerald Foundation Awards for individual commitment and a Special Achievement Award, as well as a National Lifetime Achievement Award from the Canadian Environmental Network, Nature Canada's Douglas Pimlett Award, and of course, an AWA Alberta Wilderness Defender Award. Martha was a people hugger and a tree hugger, and always a true friend of the environment. She helped create the Clean Air Strategic Alliance, one of the most effective consensus-based organizations on environmental issues in North America. She was active in many NGOs, including the AWA, Prairie Acid Rain Coalition, the Canadian and Alberta Environmental Networks, National Air Issues Coordinating Committee, Friends of the West Country, and the Parkland Airshed Management Zone. Although expert at bringing enemies together, Martha could take on the biggest adversaries in court and win. She was instrumental in changing processes, laws, and attitudes. My proudest moment was when Martha and I took our fight over the Old Man Dam all the way to the Supreme Court. With the help of a great legal team, the Piikani Nation, and many supporters, including the AWA, Friends of the Old Man River, won a landmark ruling that changed environmental assessment law in Canada. Endless pressure applied endlessly. We can indeed wear down some tough rocks. Defending nature played a huge part in bringing meaning to Martha's life. Before passing, she wrote a new vision for Alberta. It included a stable, resilient, healthy economy based on energies of the future, not on energies of the past. She added, we need to truly protect our wilderness, native prairies, wetlands, and rivers, not just for their beauty and recreational opportunities, but for biological diversity and the fundamental human needs they help meet. Martha asked us to continue to defend the environment in her memory. AWA does that every day in our work on wild spaces and the creatures that inhabit them. Many other wilderness defenders are honored on our recognition wall at the office. They and many others who we haven't gotten around to honoring yet are the giants on whose shoulders we stand. Tonight, we also celebrate the many other wilderness defenders like the indefatigable Linda Duncan, who have helped us enormously in that struggle to advance environmental protection, as well as the environmental rights of all Canadians. Thank you all for zooming in. Now I'll step aside and let our wonderful friend Linda take over and tell us a bit about her remarkable journey. Thank you.
Okay, am I unmuted? Hello?
You sure are, Linda. You're good to go.
Okay, thanks. Well, this is indeed a huge honor and a huge surprise, and I'm deeply touched. I've had a remarkable career, but I'll tell you, I remain jealous of all my biologist friends who got to spend their careers outdoors in the wilderness while I slaved away with paper in the office. And if you could see my office right now, you'd see most of that paper still here. We're trying to deal with it, Cheryl. I too am speaking to you tonight from Treaty 6 land, Papache's territory, and for the Métis peoples. I have been a very fortunate Albertan. I was blessed with a family and friends who had a deep love and appreciation for nature. I had a very privileged childhood. I spent every summer out at Lake Wabamun with gay abandon, playing in the water in the tall grasses or in the forest and maintaining animal cemeteries. In the summer, I could go hiking. In the winter, I went skiing. And I grew up on the edge of the city. My family kept moving to the edge of the city, so we were near ravines. Eventually, my family moved to 40 acres near Devon, overlooking a massive marsh looking west. So I couldn't help but become an environmental lawyer. It would have been crazy that I didn't. And I thank my family. I just want to share with you my wonderful father, long ago lost to the family. But after he retired and we found, and he died, we found all these letters he wrote. He kept writing letters to the Texas wildlife officers complaining because he read stories that Americans were killing whooping cranes. But he did also write a lot of letters complaining about when he got big bags of dog food that they weren't full. And he actually got free dog food bags. My mother, though, was actually the main driver of my engagement. And I would often say, why don't you write a letter? So my talk is my common theme that I have followed more than 40 years, and that's law and order for the environment. And I believe that very strongly. I have fought for that day one. That's why I went to law school. I wanted to work with Indigenous peoples and support their rights and to protect the environment. And I have to admit that when I first graduated, I naively applied to work for Indian Affairs. And fortunate to this day, they turned me down. They said they didn't need any lawyers at this time. And I said, well, I never want to be a lawyer. I just want to work with Indigenous people. So I consider myself very fortunate that I didn't get into the bowels of that department. We have had the worst of the worst struggles in our wonderful province of Alberta for far too many decades, struggling for citizens to have a voice in decision-making that impacts our environment. And of course, we may have been blessed with energy resources, but that has been the curse for our environment. And that is why I have fought my entire career for strengthened environmental laws, their effective enforcement, and the right of the public not only to have a voice in decision-making, but also to have the legal power to hold governments accountable. And as was mentioned, I did form the Environmental Law Center, and originally we did directly represent, but I will tell a little story of why we had to back off on that. And when that power failed, I began the campaign for a SERA Legal Defense, now Eco-Justice Lawyer in Alberta, and I'm still hounding them to provide more resources for Northern Alberta because we have lots of work for them. I did indeed table 4 times in the House of Commons an Environmental Bill of Rights. We almost got that through 3rd reading. It was actually a blessing that it didn't, because both the Liberals and Conservatives killed my bill at committee. But I persisted and I continued to table it, and I persisted in encouraging the governments of the day to enact those very rights. And we are still waiting for that to happen, even though we get these shallow, hollow promises. I did draft an Environmental Bill of Rights for Alberta back in the late 1970s with David Kilgour, who was then an environmental prosecutor. And that was through the Canadian Bar Association. Sadly and typically, the Energy Bar of Calgary vetoed that bill. And so that inspired me throughout my career to finally try to do that at the federal level. And hopefully one day that will actually occur. When I was working with the Social Planning Council, soon after I graduated, I actually worked with a great group. It was called Save Tomorrow, Oppose Pollution, Stop. And they were a wonderful group that wrote letters to the Provincial Minister of Environment every single day. And Louise Swift, who was very strong in that group, her garage became full of this correspondence. They also ran a picture competition every summer for the worst polluted pictures, and did a trip on the Athabasca River by canoe every summer and took pictures of the then expanding oil sands. Unbeknownst to myself and Alex Pringle, STOP appeared at the hearings on the first big oil sands project by Imperial Oil and announced to the hearing that he and I were the legal counsel. So I had to hop in an old broken down car and drive up there in a snowstorm, and we slept on the floor of a trapper's cabin. And that was when I really came to the realization that, you know, there was one public interest lawyer there representing about 80 interveners. And I decided that what we had to do is we had to find the support so that we could have legal representation, access to costs, access to scientists for the public to participate constructively. And that is, we used to have a community outreach office of Alberta Environment, heaven forbid, where our dear friend Susie Washington once worked. And I actually got a small $5,000 grant from that office, and I did a big report and making the case for intervener costs before all the Energy Board hearings in Alberta. And we, of course, worked closely with Vern Millard and Jerry DeSorcy, once wonderful chairs of that board. And off and on, we still have those powers. So I used that report to go to the Alberta Law Foundation and sought the funding to actually establish Environmental Law Center in 1981. And I'm happy to say that organization, more than 40 years later, is still there. I wish they were more activist. I want you to all hound them and ask them to be more activist. At some point in time, I was actually on the board of AWA. And to tell you the truth, I can't exactly recall when in my career. Was it before or after I founded the Environmental Law Center? But I, of course, remember the debates that Dick Ferris and I would have over whether or not you actually needed legally enforceable measures to protect the eastern slopes. So there you are. If we'd had them, we would be, of course, we did have some laws protecting the eastern slopes from coal mines. A lot of good that did, because along comes Jason Kenney and rescinds those laws. Initially at the Environmental Law Center, we did research, we told citizens about the rights, we campaigned for stronger laws and the enforcement, but we also directly represented citizens, farmers in energy boards, appeal board, and so forth. But one day when I was representing, it might have been Alberta Wilderness Association, at a proposal by Cantera Resources, as I recall, the lawyer representing Cantera thought that we were far too effective. So that lawyer went to the Alberta Law Foundation and said, this organization you fund is unfairly competing with private law firms. And so the Alberta Law Foundation said, you have to stop representing directly or we'll pull your funding. So sad day, we had to do that. Before that, we had the wonderful Wes Smart, who was taking on stinky feedlots and so forth in Alberta. And he went on to have a fabulous career in Environment Canada, as I recall, as one of the lead prosecutors. So we had to back off on that, but we continued to do a lot of work referring people to lawyers. And sometime in that period, and I can't remember exactly, I worked closely with the wonderful Brian Szynski, who was also once president of AWA, and we formed the Canadian Environmental Network. And eventually we had networks across Canada, and to this day we still have the Alberta Environmental Network. The reason why we pushed for that is because a number of us were fed up with once a year, everybody and their dog would get together and meet with the Environment Minister. And it was just not an effective movement. What we realized is we wanted to meet with the Energy Minister. So we formed this entity, and thereafter we started leading the challenge. Instead of sitting back and waiting for Environment Canada to consult with us, we formed what we fondly called the Cockeye. So we had caucuses for fisheries and environmental impact assessment and toxics and for Aboriginal interests and farmers and you name it. And as I recall, Martha Kostuch was probably involved in a good lot of those. The whole idea was so that people across Canada would focus their energies on just a couple of topics, and we became far more effective. But the challenge remained, is always fighting to access to information, fighting a right to be heard. And I struggled at that for 7 years before I moved on. I remember early on in my career in the Environmental Law Center, one of my first speeches I gave to the Professional Biologists Conference. And my speech was called The Minister May, because then all the powers were discretionary. But I can remember the great horror of most of these biologists that I thought that they should be working directly with environmental activists. So to this day, it's a struggle. Thank heavens we have organizations like Alberta Wilderness Association who do put their careers and their energy and their credentials on the line and speak up for our wilderness. But it continues to be a struggle. And then after 7 years at the Law Center, I did a beautiful 6-month retreat with Cheryl Bradley and Julie Bauer, who I think are both on the call. Hello to both of you, our fellow desperates and your desperados. Hey, I'm still waiting for mine, work on that. We went off to Africa and just had an absolutely phenomenal time backpacking around and just staying in local places. And it was just a trip of a lifetime. When I came back, because before I left the Law Center, I had sponsored an international conference on effective environmental enforcement. And as a result of that, somebody in Environment Canada approached me and said they wanted to bring me in on an executive interchange, which is usually just offered to people like Imperial Oil or whatever. And so I went in with the idea that I would just help to do an enforcement compliance policy for the Fisheries Act, but I ended up transforming that whole unit of Environment Canada into believing in enforcement. And thereafter, for the rest of my life, the regional enforcement officers became my best buddies. And even after I was long gone from Environment Canada, I constantly got calls from them saying, Linda, you have to do something about this. We're not getting support for enforcement. One of those regional investigators, Gordon Thompson, went on to help me do teaching for enforcers in Yukon, in Bangladesh, and Indonesia. And it was a great delight working with him. And also my friend, Francis Gordon, who was an environmental prosecutor, helped me in that training. Okay, and from Environment Canada, okay, I had an option then. Was I going to apply for the position as, of course, I recommend it should be Director of Enforcement and it should be independent from the department. And of course, after I left, the job description increased and we went from 2 staff to many hundreds now. But I knew I didn't have a chance because most of the mindset in that department was that environmental officers are the friends of industry and they're basically free legal consultation. And a result of a lot of that, a lot of prosecutions were lost because of officially induced error. Happy to say I think environmental enforcement is much more effective in Environment Canada now. So instead of vying for that position, which I knew I probably wouldn't have a chance at, I took a CETA contract where I taught environmental law at Dalhousie Law School half the year. The other half I was in Indonesia helping to establish their environmental regulation and enforcement system. And that was an incredible opportunity. I have lots of tales that I can tell about various offices that I went into with my Indonesian associates, where you'd walk into an environment office and it was all military officers with their hats laid out on the counter. And I remember going in to meet with one senior officer and he came through a secret door and it was a little intimidating. I know that the young lawyers and even the senior deputy I worked with were quite stunned at the things that I was saying, but they felt this is great, let the Canadians say it. I remember speaking while I was working on the MD project in Indonesia. I was invited to deliver a paper at an international environmental assessment conference in Bangkok. And instead, I gave a talk on stop paying all your attention to environmental impact assessment, because if you don't have the mechanisms to make these conditions binding in licenses and permits, it's a waste of time. And that has always been my mentality. So I know I stunned the conference, but everybody wanted a copy of my paper. So I won't give all the details of what happened in Indonesia because I got to move on. I know I'm talking too much. I want to share with you how strongly I believe in taking the environment to court. And, you know, I'm very involved now in trying to protect our river valley. And a number of people are wanting to go to court on a number of decisions. And still we run into people who are saying, well, I'm not sure we want to do that. That might be too aggressive. And I just am very blunt and say, you've got to be willing to hold our government officials accountable. I have to share two of my favorite court decisions. And of course, Cliff mentioned it, Friends of the Old Man. And of course, it's always bugged me that Stuart Elgee has given the credit for that decision. But in fact, the idea of taking the federal government to court, because the early on ERP guidelines order for environmental impact assessment, I argue to the entire environmental community, is legally binding and enforceable. Nobody would support me. I remember, Cliff, we actually met in Calgary with Thomas Berger, who didn't believe us that this case was winnable. And in the end, it was actually taken to the Supreme Court, one of the most important court decisions ever made, because the judge ruled that the federal government shares jurisdiction over the environment. My second favorite is a series of actions were brought against the federal government for failure to protect the caribou in northern Alberta. Sadly, the environmental organization cases just didn't win. But similar actions were brought by 4 First Nations in Alberta. And they did win that case. And that case was won against the now late Jim Prentice. And the court ruled that they struck down his decision on protection of the caribou habitat, saying, you can't do that unless you deliver on your constitutional obligation to consider Aboriginal rights and treaty rights. And I consider that one of the most important decisions. And frankly, I applaud every brave environmental organization, big or small, for taking that next step and going to the courts, because that is far too often necessary to hold our governments accountable. I think I mentioned the formation of the Canadian Environmental Network and the Alberta Environmental Network. At one point, we actually broke with all the Eastern Canadians because we were demanding of Environment Canada they give us $1 million a year to fund all the networks, and the Eastern groups wouldn't agree. So we called ourselves the West is the best and the East is the beast, and started working a lot with Western Americans. That was a fun time. And that was when David Brower came up a lot to meet with us. After being the chief, oh, actually, that was a fun thing too. When I was the chief of enforcement Environment Canada, while I was there, I actually finished writing my book on private prosecution that was published by the Environmental Law Center. I'm sure they wouldn't have appreciated that. But I also remember driving with the government lawyers to a training session for inspectors. And en route, they kept sort of patting me in the arm and saying, it's okay, dear, I know that you're bringing in action about the old man, but you'll never win that. And so it was a great delight to me when we in fact won that. While I was teaching environmental law at Dalhousie, I also worked behind the scenes with environmentalists across Canada on SIA reform and helped to kickstart the East Coast Environmental Law Association. So after I left Indonesia, I went from the heat of Jakarta to the Whitehorse Northern Lights. And it was one of the best times of my life. What a beautiful place to live. And I was the first ever assistant deputy of resources, responsible for northern agriculture, fish and wildlife, field services, and I created the environmental protection unit. And of course, in Yukon, everything was about land claims because most of them weren't settled then. And of course, huge issue about the protection of the caribou, which was basically driven by the First Nation rights. And huge issue of the poisoning of wolves, which was my responsibility. One of those cases where we were concerned about one of the outfitters dropping poison, I didn't have to complete that investigation because his plane crashed. Thank heavens, my wonderful Deputy Minister up there, Rob McWilliam, exempted me from oversight of the wolf control program because I just couldn't stomach it. We dealt with rafting. Oops, I'm already 20 minutes. See, there I am. I'm so good I timed myself. We worked on the, the Peel watershed, and when I was a member of Parliament, I helped to celebrate finally the Peel watershed being protected. We dealt with the salmon harvesting rights with Alaska, placer mining. But unfortunately, a couple of months after I moved to Yukon, with a protest vote, we went from a very innovative NDP, where the minister used to go fly fishing, to the Yukon Party. And basically, I was driven out of the department, and my deputy left as well. So I had the opportunity to work for a year with First Nations on the environmental side of their land claims. But then I had an incredible opportunity to be the first head of law and enforcement for the NAFTA Environment Commission in Montreal. And I formed the first regional network of environmental enforcers for both wildlife and pollution control in the world. There are now more than 100 of those around the world. And I helped to organize training for all the CITES enforcement officers. And I will never forget the experience in Jalisco, Mexico, where there was a training session to identify parrots and birds of prey. We did one on the crocs and the caiman, and amazing stories from the American officers. That was heavy duty crime. And I skipped the one on snakes and spiders because they were dealing with the trade in red-necked tarantulas. And as all my friends know, I would not have been able to deal with that. Then after 3 years of dealing with poor bureaucracy, I had enough. I moved back to Alberta, and then ended up going to Bangladesh and did similar kind of work there as I did in Indonesia. It was very incredible work. But I went back and forth. And when I was back here, I became part of CASA as well to fight coal-fired power. And I consider that one of my greatest victories is getting the government, the whole group, to agree we had to start capturing mercury. And this is the only jurisdiction in Canada right now that is obligated to control mercury from coal-fired. I also got them to pass a hotspots protocol, which gave citizens the right to trigger stricter standards. Then I deal with the Wabamun derailment. I helped to form Keepers of the Creek. And then in a moment of absolute insanity, I decided to run for office. And why did I do that? Because I knew that if Stephen Harper ever got a majority government, he would shred every federal environmental law we'd worked so long to create. After, in the second election, I did get elected. I'm the first ever NDP re-elected and again re-elected. And I held many portfolios where I did my best to infuse an environmental aspect. And yes, indeed, I did table Environmental Bill of Rights 4 times. I won't go into all the details of what I did. I did a report on the federal government missing in action on protecting the Mackenzie Basin. I've worked very closely with the Mikisew Cree on the protections of the Mackenzie Basin, and I thank Carolyn for all of her fabulous support to me in trying to get the federal government to act on protection of caribou. So back home, I'm taking on City Hall again, and I've become very active with the campaign to try to create an urban national park in the North Saskatchewan River Valley. So there you are. That's the quick rundown of my troublemaking in the environmental area to try to ensure that we have law and order for the environment, and I welcome questions.
Yee-haw! We need a clap track.
All right, I am just bringing up the chat box here, Linda. Could you unmute yourself again just to answer some of the questions that might be coming in?
Sure.
Okay, awesome. Goodness.
I did say I'm looking forward to the live champagne in 2021.
Awesome. My goodness. Well, you know what, Linda, I don't have any questions right now.
Hey!
I do.
Okay, awesome.
Jeff
I
does.
was there, yeah. But I did note that you were an AWA director in 1981. So just to, so it was right around the same time as the Law Center. So
So probably I withdrew when I actually set up the Law Center.
probably. That's a long time ago.
It wasn't Dick's fault.
It wasn't, no, it wasn't Dick's fault. Even though Dick and I had many good discussions or arguments, as I would say, on various and sundry things. It was a good time. But on the Indigenous file, I mean, that's a tough one. So what do you think the biggest way, I mean, to get kind of a common vision with the Indigenous communities? Because there does seem to be a fracturing going on, you know, between sometimes the political level and the community, just like there is in our society. But generally, I would say we're more aligned, but they're so under-resourced. So where do you start in trying to be supportive and get more resources to those communities to deal with these issues?
Well, for a brief time, Jack Layton appointed me as the Indigenous Affairs critic. And up until that time, most of the attention was to the social issues and, you know, access to schooling and services and so forth. But I focused on the benefit agreements and on the rights of Indigenous people to have a voice in decision making. And I have to say that on every committee I was on, I always fought for Western voices to be heard and for Indigenous voices. And when my committee wanted to come out to Alberta, all they want to do, they all just want to go to Calgary, and then they wanted to have a tour of the oil sands. I insisted on a meeting in Edmonton, and that they bring in all of the chiefs, the Grand Chiefs from Saskatchewan, Alberta, Northwest Territories, and the elders. And they told me that was the first time they'd ever been invited to the committee in that way. And I made them go to Fort Chip and to meet with the community. That's part of the problem is, you know, who are the voices? Are they the ones who Jason Kenney gives the money to so that they can help buy into pipelines and so forth? Or in the same way we are dealing with this mega industrial solar project of EPCOR in the River Valley, what becomes clear is a lot of the Enoch First Nation actually want to protect the area, which was originally their lands. I found it incredibly enriching working with the Mikisew Cree. And I guess through my whole career, I've always worked closely with Fort Chip. They're so isolated simply by geography, by transportation. And both the Mikisew and the Athabasca Chipewyan have been incredible advocates in Alberta. As they would admit, often they have to take contracts in the oil sands and so forth. I've met Indigenous members who just weep and say, I don't want to work there anymore, but I need to maintain my family. And so the work that Melody Lepine did through Mikisew in going to UNESCO, I think is one of the most profound things that's happened in Alberta. I don't know if everybody's aware of that, but she actually went to UNESCO and got, I think, 15 directives from them, forcing the federal and Alberta and BC governments to do things like take a second look at the Site C Dam and the impact in Alberta, which has never been looked at, take greater action to protect the whole Mackenzie Delta from the oil sands, and then to give direct resources so that the First Nation and Métis communities could be directly involved in that work. It continues to be a struggle, but there is amazing work being done right within those communities. It is a struggle, but they've been very effective in their lawsuits, as I mentioned, the ones against former Minister of Environment, Jim Prentice. I know that the environmental community has always struggled. I often say to people, you know, don't speak for First Nations. Invite them to come forward and speak what their view is and share resources with them so that they can be just as well prepared. We had a number of First Nations people and Métis testifying, fighting this big industrial solar installation in the River Valley. it's not easy, but I think mostly it's about respect. And it's the same way that we want to have the alternative voices of Alberta who actually care about protecting. It's the same with, you know, encouraging their voices, but heaven knows we could use more resources so that we could reach out and so we could collaborate. And there's nothing worse than this COVID, because if you're trying dealing with a northern isolated community, they have dial-up, you know, technology. How are they going to participate in Zoom, and how are they even going to go to school? So there are just basic needs like safe drinking water. It's just, it is sinful that to this day, it is sinful that Cindy's campaign to have equal resources to First Nation communities still has not been delivered, and they're still in court with the federal government. So, you know, we need to fight, we need to work on many levels, just getting them the basic resources. You look at the caliber of people who've come forward and graduating from universities and colleges, and the kind of work that they're doing. The Native Studies here at University of Alberta is just stunning, the work that they're doing. So I don't have a magic answer, but I just think always it's just to have the ultimate respect for their perspective, and just keep reaching out.
That's really great advice, Linda. Thank you.
Oh, plus, among the 100 amendments that I tabled to amend C-69, the supposed new wonderful federal assessment law, by the way, all of which the Liberals refused to even debate or accept, many of those were to incorporate the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. The Liberals will not even include that in the Sustainable Development Act. So, you know, we have wonderful people like Sinclair in the Senate. There are a number of First Nation people in the Senate who are doing that incredible work, but it's an ongoing struggle.
Awesome. Thanks, Linda. I have a question here for you from Bill Reynolds. What do you think were the major reasons the Bill of Rights was never passed? So I'm assuming that's the Environmental Bill of Rights.
I wish I knew. I'll tell you where I finally gave up on being in Parliament is I could not deal with the hypocrisy anymore. I am tired of governments who talk the talk and don't deliver. And, you know, the first letter I wrote when the federal Liberals were first elected was when McKenna became the minister. And I wrote to her and talked about how the federal government used to support the Canadian Environmental Network, how important it is as a constructive means for them to reach out, and particularly across the regions to the local folks. And she's never done it. It was John Baird who killed that fund when he was briefly environment minister under Harper. But the Liberals, what, they've been in for 6 years and they have never restored that fund. So I think I've lost track of what you asked. I get on my
just the reasons why that bill wasn't passed.
Oh, well, I don't know why it wasn't passed. I mean, I fought for stronger rights in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Those amendments that we proposed 4, 5, 6 years later, the Liberals have still never upgraded that act. The good news is we did a big review of SARA, and the good news is, because it was a Harper government then, is they did not amend SARA. So I think AWA needs to be tracking those bills because, well, you know, you reach out to protect wildlife and their habitat. We have things like coal mines and oil sands and forestry operations and so forth that are regulated, and we need to, you know, to protect that habitat. It's absolutely critical that we get those rights enshrined. And I don't know, you know, I think people need to be writing to the Liberals and saying, why have you not tabled? I gave them option after option for 11 years. I'd be happy if you steal my bill. You know, there was a big event before I left Parliament, sponsored by the Suzuki Foundation. And they invited 3 representatives, and I think Elizabeth May was there too, from our Environment and Sustainable Development Committee. And we were celebrating because Suzuki Foundation with Blue Dot had run a huge campaign on environmental rights. And we had a big celebration. So they like to step forward and say, oh yeah, we believe in environmental rights, but they don't do the next step of actually enshrining them. So it's a struggle. We need those in the Fisheries Act. My former colleague Finn Donnelly tried to do that in the amendments to the Fisheries Act, but we couldn't get them in. The same in navigable waters protection. So the reason why I wanted the Environmental Bill of Rights is because we had some of those in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, but they never, and a few in SIA, but we don't have them in the Fisheries Act, we don't have them in navigable waters, we don't have them in a lot of federal resource legislation. So it was intended as an umbrella law that would extend the duties of the government to uphold the law and to enforce it effectively, and the rights of the public to hold them accountable. Is pretty straightforward in my mind. The Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development testified on my bill and many of my amendments, strongly supporting them. And they like to congratulate, they love the commissioners, but they still wouldn't do it.
That's really interesting. Kind of on this train of thought with, making robust legislation, Carolyn Campbell has a question for you. What would you suggest in terms of preventing the gutting of federal laws like SARA?
Just be vigilant. I think that there should be a big organized campaign now, in the same way that we had those, sub-caucuses of the Canadian Environmental Network. I know that Carolyn is fantastic, and I thank her so much for all the support she gave to me in my raising questions on the caribou. I would be reaching out to the other groups who have been fighting for the protection of the caribou, and also to the environmental law groups, and try to get to go to a coalition together, and then seek funding from Minister Wilkinson to work together and coming up with a framework to how they could strengthen that law. That is one of the worst blasphemies that has occurred at the federal level, is that even the minimal binding responsibilities in there, government after government, and particularly I fault the Liberals, have not lived up to their responsibilities of delivering on those. And I would just suggest getting organized right now and seeking some clear funding and a direct consultation route to Wilkinson's department. And approaching all of the, the environment minister and the critics, and saying, can you please make the review of SARA a priority? There's pros and cons to that, because I have noticed that both Liberals and Conservatives end up kind of eroding a lot of protections. But I think there is potential for strengthening that legislation, but also strengthening the resources in Environment Canada to be delivering on the responsibilities and to actually to assert their powers.
Awesome. I think we have time for a couple more questions. I have a question here from Heinz Unger. Linda, you mentioned you went to Jamaica. When did you go there, and what did you achieve?
Oh gosh, that was, I'm trying to remember in between things that I was doing. Maybe it was after I left Dalhousie or before I went to Dalhousie. And it was a very brief contract. And it was to establish with the Jamaican Environmental Protection Department a similar unit to what we established as Canada on the Environmental Management Development Initiative in Indonesia, and to provide them with a framework of how to do environmental protection, wildlife protection, and so forth. So I did manage to provide a very brief outline. The good news is my former deputy, Rob McWilliam, actually was hired, and he went there for 2 years and helped to try to implement. Now, what has happened since, I don't know. That was one of my briefers. I never really wanted to be one of those consultants that had a laptop and zipped into countries and just did a written report and disappeared. And that's why I preferred the long-term one, like the one in Indonesia and Bangladesh. But I was happy to say that I think that CETA did come through, whether or not they've maintained it. The struggle with international development always is, in a lot of these entities, they're always getting all these competing international assistance, in Japan, the World Bank, and so forth. And so they often just keep repeating the work doing over and over again. But I've always found the Canadian model stiller. And it wasn't trying to say, do it our way or the highway, which was very much the American way. We just worked collaboratively with the people in those countries and to build their strength on the ground, or kind of the community development model, which I've always believed in.
Right. So, bringing it back to the scope of Alberta, I have a question here from Patricia Brooker. She's asking, what environmental issues in Alberta would you flag today?
Sad to say, none of them have gone away. I think that there's going to be, and in particular in COVID, right? People, and if people don't have very many resources, they're looking to find escape to the environment. And I noted in CBC Local here had a call in, where do you want to go to escape? And almost 99% were to the river valley and to the ravines. And we just did a whole new policy for the city, and they claim, they'll draw the lines on the map. And we actually have a bylaw that says that the city's been worst offenders and we have to stop any industrialization of the river valley. And then half a council and the mayor vote in favor of a massive industrial solar installation just for EPCOR in the valley. I think that's going to be the huge, there's going to be a lot of attention there. And I'm delighted to say that there are a number of umbrella groups here of diversity of people who work in parks and recreation, or biologists, people who used to work within government, who are coming together and coming up with, big policy ideas. And there's a lot of people excited about the idea of an urban national park in our river valley. I think that we've lost a lot of urban forest and a lot of wildlands adjacent to our cities. And I find it just a tragedy, because the city I grew up in is not the same city that children are growing up in now. So I'm fighting with the group Keepers of the Creek to protect my creek area and to protect the river valley. Clearly, energy is going to continue to be a big issue, but we do have the support internationally of people doing that. I don't envy Heather McPherson taking on my role in the House. You can imagine how popular we are when we're calling for greater environmental protections on pipelines and energy development. But people just have to keep speaking out. I remember some of the great work that was done on forestry by Peter Lee, showing the loss of forestry, of forests just from conventional oil and gas. We need to be getting into schools, but I know on climate, thank heavens for the youth, right? They won their right to actually bring their case to court, and the government trying to block that was crushed. So I will forever believe in using the legal mechanisms, whether it's going to court or holding city councils accountable, holding our provincial government accountable, which is pretty tough when you have majority governments. The best blessing we can ever have is more minority governments. And I say, don't just vote, get involved in the next municipal and provincial and federal elections, and encourage good people to run for office and support those who are espousing the kinds of things that you believe in. It is so important.
Linda, you talk about how, we're seeing a lot of lost wild spaces in Alberta. I have a question here from HT, and I'm assuming they're asking, what advice would you have for preventing the delisting of so many of Alberta's parks right now?
Well, of course, I'm not a member of the Alberta Bar, so I can't give legal advice, but I can certainly encourage. I think the campaign right now with Protect Our Parks signs are great. Apparently is 10,000 or more than that of the signs out there right now. People need to be writing to their own MLAs, and they need to be phoning their offices nonstop and just raising Cain about this. I think that the Albertans are going to be most impacted by this are our rural communities, because they escape to those smaller little campgrounds and parks, and a lot of those are the ones that are disappearing. It is absolutely outrageous at a time when we should be using provincial powers to protect more of our wild spaces, because people need that escape. People are really suffering in COVID. And I know AWA has been very involved in this, and I would just use all means that everybody has. Social media, use social media, because that's what young people look at, and encourage people. Tell people exactly what to say and phone. Provide the phone numbers. Provide a list of the phone numbers for the MLAs and the minister. How do we impact this current regime? I don't know. But I just thank AWA and CPAWS and other local groups for the fantastic campaign that they're running. I loved the last issue of the AWA magazine, with the stories that people told about their favorite park. I think we need to get more of those stories out and get them into social media, get them onto Facebook, encourage people to write about their favorite park that they went to as a child or taking their kids, and write that in a letter to their MLA.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think we have time for one more question, Linda, and this one is from Kristen. Which organizations are you working with on the creation of an urban national park in North Saskatchewan? It sounds like a fantastic and deserving initiative.
Well, there are two umbrella groups, both of which admit they have way too long names. River Valley, and Ravine Conservation Association. There's just, each of them have a plethora of amazing people. And I actually tried to encourage this to happen about 6 years ago, but none of the Conservative MPs in Edmonton were willing to join in on it. So I was delighted to return to Edmonton and find out that there are huge numbers of people who are very supportive of this. And, detailed level work that people are doing. I know Sierra Club is involved in it, university professors who do work in recreation, biology professors, a lot of just individuals, young people who want to get involved in protecting the River Valley. There is a group called the North Saskatchewan River Valley Conservation Group. Harvey Vogt leads that. But if somebody's really keen, they could contact me. I know the former head of the Natural Areas Program. I was chair of the Natural Area Advisory Council, and we came up with a conservation policy to provide for corridors for wildlife. But I think that policy seems to have disappeared from City Council. He's very involved and he's very informed. So I have great hope for it, and I know I'm my own worst enemy. So between enjoying my new 1.5-year-old pooch, Kona, who's lying beside me right now, and I will be fighting to protect our river valley and ravines.
Wonderful. Linda, thank you so much for taking the time to answer those questions and giving such a wonderful talk. I know we all
tend to ramble.
No, not at all. We all appreciate the time and effort and dedication that you've put into protecting Alberta's wild spaces and wild spaces across the world. So thank you. I'm going to invite AWA's President Jim Campbell for some closing remarks at this time.
All right. On, Lisa. So thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. It's my privilege to kind of put a wrap up on the evening, and it's been a wonderful evening. First, I want to thank everybody that tuned in tonight. It's great to have you online. The more we get together, I think the more we get inspired to get back out there and do the work that needs to be done, fight the fights that need to be fought. So thank you for being here. I know your support of AWA, not in terms of letters you've written and commitments you've made to committees, and your support, your donations really matter. And just a little nudge for anybody who maybe hasn't made a donation this year, please consider it. We would really appreciate it. Without you, we can't continue the work, and it's because of you that we're able to do this. I first want to thank Christiane and Vivian for their work in putting this evening together and the other lectures we have in the series. And of course, Nisa, thank you for your work on the technical side. It's been beautiful and smooth and no hitches, so that's makes it all worthwhile. And of course, finally, I want to welcome Linda as a wilderness and wildlife defender. Frankly, I really enjoyed the ramble. It was wonderful to hear all that litany of all your accomplishments, all your adventures. It was spirited, and I don't think you're any less spirited now than you were 40 years ago when you were on the AWA board. It was inspiring to me, and it's champions like you that make all the difference for us. Change is never easy, it's never fast, but it does happen. And you touched on a couple of really big themes beyond conservation for me. Some people are calling the Indigenous Renaissance, which I think goes hand in hand with a greater environmental awareness. Wab Kinew has talked about that there is no future without Indigenous values in our thinking. And then on the piece on international development, the Canadian way. I've worked in some work in that area, and truly we go in as partners rather than as bosses, if you will. And I think that is why Canada has such a great reputation in so many parts of the world. So Linda, again, thank you for all your comments tonight, your joyful adventures, and please look forward to having you as part of the AWA for many, many years to come. Thank you all.